So I'd like to give you a quick review of the characteristics and needs of living things. The other day you went ahead and completed this graphic organizer. You had life, and then you had characteristics and needs. And off of that, you were supposed to put 10 boxes: 4 needs, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 characteristics. I have more boxes than that because I added more details to this, and I want to go over that with you and cover it. So here are the 6 characteristics: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So let's start to talk about these things and talk about some of the detail that we added here. And you don't need to necessarily add this on your end, but you might want to copy and paste some things that you think are interesting or that you didn't know, or add some things to it while we're talking about it. So one of the characteristics of all living things is that living things perform complex chemical activities. When we talk about complex chemical activities, we're talking about things like excretion. Excretion is removal or expelling of waste. For example, expelling carbon dioxide every time you exhale, that's excretion. All living things do that. All living things go ahead and digest. They break down food into simpler molecules. Okay, this is an example of complex chemical activities. Every living thing doesn't digest, but it's an example of performing chemical activities. So you break food down into simpler molecules. They can be used in chemical reactions. Another example of complex chemical activity is respiration, using oxygen and glucose to make energy. Use oxygen and glucose, you form ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, which is cellular energy. And in the process, carbon dioxide and water are produced. Carbon dioxide is poison, so it's released, and water is reused by the body because it's such an important inorganic compound. In terms of photosynthesis, autotrophs use photosynthesis to make their food. They take in sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and they make food in the form of glucose, and in the process make oxygen, and oxygen is released, is a waste product of this process. But don't forget that just because they release it in photosynthesis, autotrophs will respirate and use oxygen and the glucose they make to make their own energy, to make the ATP they need. Another characteristic of all living things is that all living things have cellular organization. They're made of cells. You're either unicellular, you have a single cell, or you're multicellular, where you're made of many cells. All living things grow and develop. Growth is adding new cells, while developing is changing over time. So when you add new cells, your cells, they go through asexual reproduction. They divide. They're clones of each other. And then, so that's adding cells. But your cells can also get bigger, but to a certain extent. And then they have to stop getting bigger. And we'll talk more about that another time. But cells also change over time. They differentiate. They become new cells. They perform different functions. So examples of this would be metamorphosis. If you're like a butterfly, you turn from a caterpillar to a butterfly, or a fly goes from a maggot to an adult fly. If you're a human, puberty is an example of that, where you're going from a child to an adult. All living things respond to their environments, another characteristic. An example of this, there has to be a stimulus, some kind of change in the environment. And so when the bell rings, what do you want to do? You want to get up and leave. So the stimulus is the bell, the response is getting up and leaving. So all living things are made of similar chemicals. So these similar compounds, these organic compounds, they're used in metabolism, all of the chemical activities in your body. So an example of some of the chemicals, carbohydrates, one of those organic compounds. There are 2 types of organic compounds. There are simple sugars like glucose, which is ready to be used to make energy. And then there's complex ones like starch, like rice and potatoes. Those carbohydrates have to be broken down further in order to be useful for the organism. Oftentimes, those more complex carbohydrates are broken down into the simpler carbohydrates like glucose. Nucleic acids, used in every cell, that's the genetic code for life. That's how we pass on our traits from parent to offspring. That's how the cells know the instructions to be able to make proteins, to do other things in the body, all of your metabolic processes. One of those is DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. The other is RNA, ribonucleic acid. Another similar chemical as proteins. They're used to build cellular structures, also used to make tissues like muscle. Two things you should know about proteins. One is that they are made up of building blocks. So amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. None of them are essential. Essential means that you have to get them, and your body can't make them. You have to get them from other sources. So that for us, that means we have to eat things that contain these essential amino acids. The other 11 are non-essential. That means your body can make them if you give it enough nutrients to be able to do that. So I like to think of amino acids. If you look at the cement walls in this room, they've got a shape to them. This room has shape. But if you look at the wall, you'll see that the wall is made up of individual blocks. So it doesn't get built unless you add all the blocks in. That's kind of what proteins are. They're these massive structures with building blocks of amino acids. Another protein to talk about is enzymes. Enzymes are extremely important because they speed up or catalyze, that's what catalyze means, speed up reactions in your body. And they work by a lock and key. So I'm going to kind of show you here. So you have to look up here. So I'm making a C with my hand. If that's an enzyme, enzymes will act on materials. So let's say this is a digestive enzyme. It's going to help break down a complex starch. So the starch would be the opposite shape or the complementary shape to that protein, and it would simply fit in. And when it locks in, the enzyme does something to the protein and breaks it apart. Into the substrate, they call that, and breaks it apart. Okay? So we talk about homeostasis, and we talk about the fact that we need to maintain a temperature of 98.6 degrees. Well, one of the main reasons is because if your temperature gets too high and you get too much of a fever and your body temperature keeps rising, it will denature the proteins in your body, particularly the enzymes. Denature means to change their shape. So if this C was being denatured and all of a sudden I moved my finger down to show that the C is now a little different, right? It's got this little finger thing in the middle of it, this little structure. Well, now if the substrate tried to come in there and connect, it can't get in any longer. It can no longer make that connection. And that's how metabolic processes, chemical processes in your body can shut down. And so if your temperature gets too high, it can be dangerous and even fatal if you don't correct it and bring your temperature down. So kind of a cool, important fact to know there. So we also have lipids. Lipids are another similar chemical, and lipids are, they could be two types: fats, if they're solid at room temperature, things like butter, margarine, Crisco shortening, or they could be liquid at room temperature, things like olive oil, canola oil, vegetable oil, all of those things. The last characteristic of living things, every living thing reproduces, and there are two types of reproduction: asexual, which we talked about a minute ago. We'll talk about our body cells being able to asexually reproduce, to produce more body cells and grow. Organisms can do this by themselves if you're a single-celled organism, and they will produce a clone of themselves if they only asexually reproduce. Sexual reproduction creates a lot of variety because two parents, usually male and female, are combining their genes in the offspring, and so we get lots of variety in the offspring. That's why you're very different from your brothers and sisters and very different from each other, because you're the product of sexual reproduction. So in addition to these characteristics, we have needs. And so the four basic needs, one of them is using energy. Every living thing uses energy. If you're heterotroph, you ingest other organisms. If you're autotroph, you make your own food. Regardless, you make the energy from that food, right? Oxygen, glucose, you respirate, and you produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate, once again. And you also release water and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is expelled, water is reused. You must maintain homeostasis. All living things must maintain stable internal conditions. Things like temperature, things like blood sugar levels. So we talked about temperature being one, what would happen if you don't maintain the temperature. So other things that the doctor checks when you go to the office, right? Your reflexes, making sure your nervous system is in homeostasis. Checks other things in your blood to make sure you're in homeostasis if you're not feeling well. So maintaining homeostasis is very important. Living space. We need living space to eat, find food, water, shelter, and to find a mate. If those things are not in abundant supply for the organisms in the area, organisms will compete for those things. And the last need of living thing is water, the universal solvent. Most important inorganic compound, it's inorganic because it does not contain carbon. It's H2O is the formula for it. There's no carbon in there like the other organic compounds we talked about. That's why it's not in the same category as them. Most chemical reactions happen in the presence of water, and it's so important. 70% of your body is made of water. So that just goes to show you how important that really is. So those are the characteristics and a summary of the characteristics and needs of living things.